Hi, my name is Christy Krupinski, and today you will hear about the Typhoid Mary incident. But first, let's talk about what typhoid is. Typhoid or typhoid fever is a worldwide illness caused by the ingestion of food or water that has been contaminated with the feces of an infected person with typhoid. Mary Malone was the first known healthy carrier of the bacteria that causes typhoid. Before her, it was unknown to most of anyone that a person could be a healthy carrier. The public health didn't even know how to take care of this particular situation since it was the first of its kind. In the story, you'll find out how many things went wrong with this first situation, from the lack of compliance on Mary's part to the ill treatment of Mary by the public health. Much of the information about the story comes from Judith Walzer Levitt and her book Typhoid Mary Captive to the Public Health. So it starts in the summer of 1906. A wealthy New York banker rented a home in Oyster Bay, Long Island, and he hired Mary Malone to cook for his family. By midsummer, 6 out of the 11 people in his house came down with typhoid. Since a common way of typhoid spread is through water or food sources, the owners of the home feared that they would not be able to rent this property again without first discovering the source of the outbreak. So they hired investigators to find the cause, but they were unsuccessful. Then they hired George Soper, a civil engineer with experience in typhoid fever outbreaks. It was him who believed that the recently hired cook, Mary Malone, was the cause. But Mary had already left the property 3 weeks earlier. So Soper began to research her employment history for more clues. He was actually able to trace Malone's employment back to 1900, and he found that typhoid outbreaks had followed her from job to job. He actually found that Malone had worked at 7 jobs in which 22 people had become ill, including one young girl who had died. Soper was satisfied that this was much more than a coincidence, yet he needed stool and blood samples from Malone to scientifically prove that she was a carrier. In March 1907, he found Malone working as a cook. To get samples from Malone, he approached her at her place of work. Having a strange man come up to you to accuse you of spreading a disease and killing people, and then asking you for some of your blood and excrement, well, that would make anybody upset. So Soper said what he had to say, and she came after him with a carving fork, and he said that he felt rather lucky to have escaped her. Soper then again tracked Malone down to her home, and he tried to approach her again. This time he brought an assistant with him. But again, Malone became enraged with anger and made it very clear to them that they were unwelcome and shouted at them as they tried to get away. So Soper then handed his research and hypotheses over to Herman Biggs at the New York City Health Department. Biggs agrees with Soper's hypothesis, and he sends Dr. Josephine Baker to talk to Malone. Malone, now extremely suspicious of all these health officials, refused to listen to Baker. Baker returned later with the aid of 5 policemen and an ambulance. And Malone was prepared this time. She was on the lookout, and she peered out of her kitchen with a kitchen fork in hand. And as they tried to come into Mary's house, she attacked them. Eventually, she evaded them, and there was a 5-hour-long search for Mary. Eventually, they found her and seized her and put her into the ambulance, and the doctor sat on her all the way to the hospital. Malone was taken to the hospital in New York. There, samples were examined, and typhoid bacilli was found in her stool. The health department then transferred Malone to an isolated cottage. It is part of the Riverside Hospital in North Brother Island. Mary Malone was taken against her force and against her will and was held without a trial. She hadn't broken any laws, so how can the government lock her up in this situation? Well, the justification that the health officials were basing their powers on were from sections 1169 and 1170 of the Greater New York Charter. This says, the Board of Health shall use any reasonable means of ascertaining the existence and the cause of disease or peril to life or health for and averting the same throughout the city. The board may remove or cause to be removed to a proper place to be by it designated any sick person with any contagious, pestilential, or infectious disease. They shall have exclusive charge and control of the hospitals for this treatment. Now, this charter was written before anyone knew of healthy carriers. These are people who seemed to be healthy but were contagious, carried a contagious form of disease that could affect others. The health officials actually believed that healthy carriers were more dangerous than those that were sick with the disease because there was no way to visibly identify a healthy carrier in order to avoid them. But to many, locking up a healthy person seemed wrong. So Mary Malone believed that she was being unfairly persecuted, and Malone did not understand a lot about typhoid fever, and unfortunately, no one tried to explain it to her. Not all people have a strong bout of typhoid fever, so thus Mary could have had typhoid fever and never known it. Though commonly known at the time that typhoid would be spread through water and food products, people who are infected with the typhoid bacillus could also pass the disease from their infected stool into food via unwashed hands. So for this reason, infected persons who were cooks like Mary Malone or food handlers had the most likelihood of spreading the disease. The judge ruled in the favor of the health officials, and Malone, now popularly known as Typhoid Mary, was remanded into the custody of the Board of Health of the City of New York. And Malone went back to an isolated cottage in North Brother Island with little hope of being released. In February of 1910, a new health commissioner decided that Malone could go free as long as she agreed never to work as a cook again. Anxious to regain her freedom, Malone accepted the conditions. Some people believe that Malone never had any intention of following the health officials' rules, thus they believe Malone had a malicious intent with her cooking as well. But not working as a cook pushed Malone into service of a domestic service in other domestic positions, which did not pay very well. Feeling healthy, Malone still did not believe that she was the one that could spread typhoid, so eventually she went back to work as a cook. In January of 1915, in the Sloan maternity ward in Manhattan, they suffered a typhoid fever outbreak. 25 people became ill and 2 of them died. Soon, evidence pointed to a recently hired cook, Mrs. Brown. Well, Mrs. Brown was really Mrs. Malone. If the public had shown Mary Malone some sympathy during her first period of confinement because she was an unwitting typhoid carrier, all the sympathy disappeared now after her recapture. This time, Typhoid Mary knew of her healthy carrier status, even if she didn't believe it. Thus, she willingly and knowingly caused pain and death to her victims. Malone was sent back to live in the same isolated cottage. She lived there until the end of her life. Though Mary was the first carrier found, she was not the only healthy carrier of typhoid during this time. An estimated of 3,000 to 4,500 new cases of typhoid fever were reported in New York City alone, and it was estimated that about 3% of those who had typhoid fever became carriers, creating 90 to 135 new carriers a year. Malone was not the most deadly either. 47 illnesses and 3 deaths were attributed to Malone, while Tony Labella, another healthy carrier, caused 122 people to become ill and 5 deaths. Labella was isolated for 2 weeks and then released. Malone was also not the only healthy carrier who broke the health officials' rules after being told of their contagious status. Alfonso Coltis, a restaurant and bakery owner, was told not to prepare food for other people, but then health officials found him back to work. They just agreed to let him go when he promised to conduct his business over the phone. So why is it that Mary Malone is so infamously remembered as Typhoid Mary? Why was she the only healthy carrier isolated for life? Judith Levitt believes that her personal identity contributed to this extreme treatment that she received from the health officials. Levitt claims that there was a prejudice against Malone, not only for being Irish and a woman, but also for being a domestic servant, not having a family, and not being considered a bread earner, having a temper, and not believing in her carrier status. Fortunately, during her life, Mary Malone experienced extreme punishment for something in which she had no control, and for whatever reason had gone down in history as the invasive and malicious Typhoid Mary. The end.